Welcome to the Forum on Understanding and Protecting Our Region's Drinking Water. And can it be impacted by bulk water sales?
We beat Shell. We stopped one of the biggest corporations in the world from usurping the water from our Appalachian aquifer. The people won. Yes. Shell Oil and Gas, SWEPI, I will henceforth call them Shell. It's shorter, and actually they try to hide who they are by such names as SWEPI. And Painted Post would have to start from scratch if both decide that they would still want to go ahead with this deal. I have some concerns about this new contract being formed. As a union member, I hate it when the contracts come up because once they get in the contract, they can tear things apart. So, and I would like to explain why I am concerned about this contract in a somewhat circuitous manner. Water, water everywhere, and all the boards did shrink. Water, water everywhere, nor any drop to drink. Climate change will create a time of massive ocean rise, causing destruction to more than the shrinking of boards. And with the diminishment of potable water in the world to about 1%, the consumption of water for anything but life sustenance, including those aspects of agriculture and some industry, is untenable. Agriculture and industry must use water in ways that are non-polluting and return the water to the rain cycle, or a closed-loop system of reuse, if nothing else. From a well-cited Wikipedia article on water commodity, global institutions, including the UN, warn of the impact of a growing global population and the effects of climate change on the ability of people to access fresh water. This makes the debate over improving current and future water provision an urgent one, and therefore thrusts discussion over approaches to water governance into the foreground to avert a looming crisis. That crisis is here. Back to Shell and concerns about the contract with Painted Post. In late 2013, departing Shell CEO Peter Vosser said the failure of Royal Dutch Shell's huge bet on U.S. shale was a big regret of his time as chief executive of the company. Shell has invested at least $24 billion, he says, in so-called unconventional oil and gas in North America, but it is a bet that has yet to pay off. Its North American upstream business has struggled to turn a profit, and in August 2013, Shell announced a strategic review of its U.S. shale portfolio after taking a $2.1 billion impairment. The public policy of the state of New York must be followed according to Judge Fisher's decision, and I quote, I excerpt that. New York public policy declares that comprehensive planning be undertaken for the protection, conservation, equitable, and wise use and development of the water resources of the state to the end that such water resources be not wasted and shall be adequate to meet the present and future needs for domestic, municipal, agricultural, commercial, industrial, power, recreation, and other public beneficial purposes. Thank you very much.
Todd Miller is a retired hydrogeologist who worked for the U.S. Geological Survey for 37 years at the USGS Water Science Center in Ithaca, New York. He specialized in groundwater hydrology, glacial geology, computer groundwater modeling, and water quality in cooperation with New York State Departments of Environmental Conservation and Health. Todd conducted studies of many of the primary and principal aquifers in central and western New York, including this Corning aquifer in Steuben County. He has also conducted many aquifer investigations in cooperation with federal and local governments, and he has been the author of over 50 hydrologic reports before retiring in 2013. Welcome, Todd Miller.
Thank you. First, disclaimers. I'm a retired USGS, so my views tonight does not represent the views of USGS, and I am now a private citizen, and these are my own views. The approach I'm taking tonight is to give you the knowledge, information to ask intelligent questions about a large pumping well. And two, putting myself in the shoes of a generic hydrogeologist and being approached and saying, well, we have a large pumping well, what would you do? What are the concerns? So, as Rachel said, Corning Aquifer is one of the 18 primary aquifers, the highest level protected aquifer according to the DEC criteria.
F5.
Yep.
There.
Great. There are numerous other aquifers less important than primary, known as principal aquifers. The primary aquifers, by definition, are highly productive aquifers that are tapped by large pumping centers, mainly by cities or large villages. And the principal ones are potentially high-yielding aquifers, but not tapped by a large municipality. And those are shown on all the green areas in New York State. You may have heard also of sole source aquifers, which is an EPA designation. These are the sole source aquifers in New York. You have to apply to EPA to get that criteria. However, there's really there are symbolic there's no regulatory powers to the EPA sole source because you have to have federal funds involved in their project in those areas for EPA be involved. So like in this case, there's no federal funds involved in Corning, so EPA has no jurisdiction in this area. This is the Corning Aquifer area and the modeled area I'll talk about later, known as the Corning Aquifer, is the area shown in mainly the gray area. And some of the municipality jurisdictions of Painted Post, Riverside, City of Corning, South Cortland, Town of Irwin, Gang Mills area. So some basic background aquifer definitions we'll need for today. There are two types of main aquifers. There's an unconfined aquifer, which is sand and gravel all the way up to land surface. And there are confined or buried artesian aquifers that have an impermeable layer on top of it, such as clay or glacial till. Everywhere on land surface is the recharge area for an unconfined aquifer where precip falls directly on land surface and gets down to the aquifer. And recharge areas for confined aquifers is where they extend up to land surface, typically along edges of valleys. So recharge areas are much smaller for confined aquifers than unconfined aquifers. Unconfined aquifers are very susceptible to contamination because the soils are all permeable sand and gravel from land surface down to the water table. So any spill on land surface readily seeps down to the unconfined aquifers. Confined aquifers tend to be protected from contamination by the impermeable clay layer. Now, groundwater and surface water should be considered a single resource. And several decades ago, we always treated those as two separate entities. But over time, we've learned that the two systems are very connected. Groundwater flows into streams and reverse. Sometimes a lot of streams lose stream water to the aquifer. This is probably a close cartoon picture of the cross-section of the Corning aquifer. There's an unconfined aquifer over most of the region, and there's a confined zone in some parts of the Corning aquifer. It's not everywhere there's a clay layer separating two different aquifer systems, but here and there are patches of this clay layer that makes it into a two aquifer system. But mainly, the aquifer is an unconfined system in Corning. So streams interact with the aquifer in three basic ways. Typically, the main stream gains water from groundwater seepage into it. It's the sink for the water system in a valley. Then the tributaries, the small ones that flow off the hillsides onto the aquifer, are important recharge sources because those little tributaries frequently lose water and dry up when they flow over the aquifer. Or three, both. A stream can be both a gainer or loser, depending on if there's pumping wells near it or far away. So these little tributaries that come off the uplands, they build an alluvial fan on the edge of the valley, and that's where a lot of water loses out of the tributary streams on its fan. And a tributary stream is where the stream elevation in the channel is higher than the surrounding groundwater. So water flows from a higher head to a lower head. So water moves out of the stream into the groundwater system. So tributaries recharge the groundwater system. Whereas the main trunk stream, the water level usually is the lowest in the system, and the surrounding groundwater levels are higher than the stream, so groundwater flows into the main stream, like the Chemung River, Cohocton, and Tioga. We can use a hydrograph separation analysis to determine the part of flow in a stream that is derived from storm runoff from rain and groundwater seepage. Base flow is the groundwater seepage into a channel, and during a large rainfall event, you get a spike in hydrograph representing the runoff. And you can use this analysis to separate all the storm runoff from the base flow to determine what portion of stream flow in the stream comes from groundwater and what comes from storm runoff. And typically in the Northeast, more stream flow is derived from groundwater flowing into the channel than from storm runoff. And typically, these are pie diagrams showing the percent of groundwater inflow to a stream typically and storm runoff. 55 to 70% of the water that flows past a stream gauge is usually from groundwater, and the 45 to 30% comes from storm runoff. So most water in the stream comes from groundwater. So under natural conditions, before development, before pumping, the natural groundwater system, groundwater flows and discharges to the main trunk stream. That's how the groundwater systems work. Then when development moves in, and let's say it's a small village and they put in some small pumping wells intercept some of the water that would have naturally have flown to the stream. So now we start getting less stream flow due to pumping wells. If it's a small pumping well and if it's far from the stream, we get a small divide between what flows to the well and what flows to the stream. But now we get a city development with large pumping wells and some of them near streams. We get enough cone of the depression will extend all the way to the stream. So we get two things happening. We get interception of the water that would have flown to the stream, and we get reversal stream loss coming out of the stream to the well. And that happens big time in the Corning area. The result on a hydrograph of pumping losses from the stream is shown by these two graphs. Under non-pumping conditions, a hydrograph at a stream gauge will look in the black line. And under pumping conditions, you can see a less flow and the result of decreased flows in the stream record. Springs are especially vulnerable to the effects of large groundwater withdrawals because the springs is where the very top of the water table intercepts land surface and feeds a spring. Like usually at the base of a steep hillside, you may find springs. So any small decline of groundwater levels caused by pumpings can dry up a stream. All it takes is a foot or two lower groundwater levels, and stream flow would be severely reduced, or the spring would dry up. Same with wetlands. Wetlands also reflect the groundwater table. So wetlands are important ecosystems, flood control, bodies of water, and large groundwater pumpages have large impacts on nearby wetlands also. Effects of groundwater pumping need to consider the cumulative effects of multiple wells. You can't not analyze one well at a time and say it has a large impact or not. You have to look at all the wells pumping at once. So yeah. And this just shows if someone said, well, we want to put in one well, this is going to be the effect of depleting stream flow. This one well is going to deplete 1.25 CFS out of the stream. No big deal, right? 1.25 is not that much. But if you consider a nearby well depletes it another one, and another well, another 0.75, the cumulative effect of the three wells is 2.5 CFS in this case. So that's the effect of multiple wells. The importance of considering multiple wells rather than one well individually. Sustainability. When Rachel asked me to talk on sustainability, she probably heard me first groan and then start whining, because it's a vague term. It doesn't have very defined criteria, and it's changed over time to the definition. Early on, many decades ago, sustainable groundwater amounts were just defined the amount of recharge that comes to an aquifer, and that's the amount that could be pumped out. You don't want to exceed the amount of recharge, so it didn't take into effect back then whether you dry up a stream, you affect the ecosystems, social effects, and stuff like that. So the definition of a sustainable groundwater system has changed over time and has expanded. So now it includes water quantity, effects on the environment, economic considerations, and sociological considerations. So you can see how this gets very gray and messy. Another term that was used but less popular now and losing favors was the term safe yield, and that goes back basically to the old sustainable groundwater. It only considered quantity of water available for pumping, not the other environmental, sociological, and economic considerations. So this is now kind of called a myth of groundwater sustainability. So what hydrologic factors affect groundwater sustainability? So you got to focus on the interactions of groundwater and surface water. Groundwater storage, what is the size of the groundwater reservoir container? Groundwater quality, are there contamination? What is the natural groundwater quality chemistry like? And the ecological requirements of the stream and groundwater systems. Effects of groundwater withdrawals. Large pumping wells are serious business. They have large impacts upon water systems. Pumping groundwater always causes a decline in water levels and a diversion to the pumping well of groundwater that would normally have flown to the stream. So you get a reduction in stream flows. A large pumping may also cause direct loss of stream flow, and that's stream flow reversed out of the stream to the well. and loss of wetland springs, riparian ecosystems, and you can, some cases, change the water quality conditions. The foundation of any good analysis is relying on good data. You could just read those very quickly, but you need well logs, water sampling, groundwater levels. It takes a lot of information to put together and to make an evaluation of the effects of pumping on a groundwater system. When are ecosystems and aquifers most vulnerable? They're vulnerable during droughts. When there's large amounts of flow, high base flow, storm runoff, lots of water in the stream, pumpings have minimal impacts on the stream because the quantity of water is so large compared to what loses to the wells. During average flow conditions, for instance, the Chemung River may be 500 CFS, for instance. And if the pumping wells are only pulling out, inducing 10 CFS out of that, it's a very small part. But during droughts, when the Chemung River is down to 100 CFS, then 5 or 10 loss to the wells becomes important. Then we're talking about 10% loss. So it's during droughts that large pumping wells have the largest effects. Effects of groundwater on storage. You could consider an aquifer like a reservoir, a bathtub. It has impermeable boundaries, bottom and sides, to contain the water so it doesn't flow out and escape. Wells can be looked at as a well into that reservoir, and you put a measuring stick. You turn on the well, the water levels will drop in the bathtub or aquifer, and that measures the storage loss or gain. If you drop to pumping, you're losing storage. And water availability and the pumping well efficiency are greatly associated with the saturated thickness of an aquifer. Wells pump more efficiently and more water is available the thicker the aquifer in general. Water yield is usually associated with gallons per minute per foot of drawdown. So if you have available drawdown thickness of 50 feet, a well can typically pump down 2/3 about 30 feet. And if every foot produces 10 gallons a minute at 30, it could produce 300 gallons a minute. But if you only have 10 feet of thickness, and you only pull down 6 feet of that, now we're talking 60. So thickness is an important factor, especially with a lot of wells pumping, because you're pulling the water table down quite a bit. So declines in levels from intense pumping, and as Rachel mentioned, this aquifer was designated by SRBC as potentially stressed because it's pumped so heavily, is that you get decreases in storage. Some wells may go dry in areas of the large cone depressions, but I don't think this is the case here. Pumping costs increase because the pumping is less efficient now, with less available saturated thickness. And sometimes you get interference effects of nearby wells if they're too close. The likelihood that you'll get contaminated groundwater that will be intercepted is increased, and I'll show you why later. And pumping of groundwater may cause land subsidence, but that's probably not the case here. Like San Joaquin Valley, California, there's a tremendous amount of land subsidence from overpumping in a confined aquifer system. But this system is not so confined, and the water levels don't go below the confining layer, so you won't get compaction and subsidence in this area. So the best available tool for groundwater management and to deal with complex groundwater flow systems are numerical groundwater flow models, computer flow models. And in 1988, the SRBC built a groundwater flow model. They built off my aquifer map, which is my study here was more of a kind of reconnaissance level. It was the foundation to build groundwater models and more detailed studies later. So during the past several decades, these models were great for showing the interconnection of groundwater systems and stream flow, and that was really the very valuable aspect of these models. Groundwater models such as the USGS mod flow model represents all of the groundwater and surface water features in an aquifer system. The groundwater models compute water levels. They compute the rates of flow through the system and water budgets. And the groundwater simulations are the principal means for evaluating the response of aquifer systems from pumping wells. So they're great for doing what-if scenarios. If I put a well here and pump it, where is it going to be the cone depression, decreased water levels? Is it going to dry a stream? So these models are the best way to determine the effects of large pumping withdrawals. So the 1988 Corning model, the good news, it was constructed back then, and today the model still holds up to represent the natural pre-pumping conditions. And it's still an adequate tool to provide general information how the aquifer works on a regional basis. However, on a more detailed scale, it falls apart now, and the reasons why is that the model has become outdated due to advances in computers and advances in computer software. Unfortunately, the original computer models were lost. Stearns and Weller, Leggett consultants tried to rebuild the model as best they could from the hard copy paper report. However, the reconstructed model used the same approach called a quasi 3D, and I won't get too much in detail on that, but it's an approach that's not used anymore in groundwater modeling. And it also used a very, very coarse cell size, way too large in today's modeling. They use a cell size in that model of 500 by 500 feet per each cell. And today, if I would build a model here, I would use probably 100 by 100 square feet. Back then, they used 500 by 500 cells, large ones, and this quasi 3D to save memory space on the computer. And back in those days, if you remember what they looked like back in '88, they were slow. I remember when I first did groundwater models back then, you would, before you go home at night, you would run the model all through the evening and the next day show up and see the results. And today, of course, you can run models 10 times, 50 times larger and more complex than this one, and in minutes. So today we have programs much better, much more complex to handle systems, and computers are so much faster and better now. We could make them more complex. So even Stearns and Weller and Leggett concluded that the model needs to be updated from the old rebuilt one they did of the SRBC. And they have a nice list in their report of the details that they recommend how it could be improved. So the model needs to be rebuilt using the latest versions of ModFlow and ModPath. I'll describe ModPath shortly. And preferably using pre- and post-processing software to ease editing and enhance displaying results. You could now, today's models do couple it with GIS programs to show layers, soils, highways, whatever you want, and different layers onto your results of the groundwater model. Particle tracking ModPath was not part of the original SRBC or the Leggett rebuilt model. It is so important. It is one of the best post-processing tool on ModPath. It's a program that tracks flow through an aquifer system For instance, this is the output of just mod path without mod flow without mod path. Whoops. And like I said, mod path computes water levels, and this is a contour map of an aquifer system with a cone of depression from a pumping well. What mod path does is it computes paths that contribute water to that pumping well or paths from a contamination site. In this case, this is a backward tracking analysis where particles were put at the pumping well and the model run in reverse, and the path went back to its sources of recharge. So it maps out the contributing area over the aquifer that feeds the well. In this case, if you have to have a contamination site within the contributing area, you can expect some of those contaminants to reach and go to the well. So you can see the value of that. So when you map these out, it's then important to conduct an inventory of what's in those contributing areas. You want to know the wetlands, the streams, contamination sites, anything that could be impacted by pumping. So this is what's needed throughout, not just Painted Post number 4 well, but all the municipal wells. And then you also build off of that. You have some zoning to protect the water quality in those zones. You know, prohibit certain hazardous chemical storage tanks or something like that. You can also run particle tracking mod path forward-wise to map out contaminants moving away from a contamination site. So if this is a contamination site, you could put the particles at the contamination, run it forward. In this case, if there's a nearby pumping well, it may draw in some of those contaminants to the well, or if it's out of the contributing area to the well, it'll end up in the stream. So it's also an important tool in tracking contaminants, and again, that would have been useful at the old foundry site. Looking 2D through a slice in the earth, the contributing area looks like this. If the well is pumping from a stream and the stream's in the contributing area, you get a contributing area that includes the stream and the upgraded area groundwater flow. So these are some of the things, items you would inventory in contributing areas, sources of contamination, streams, wetlands, other wells. So in a nutshell, how an aquifer system works is under pre-development non-pumping, there's a groundwater reservoir. It receives recharge from precipitation to it, and groundwater leaves the system into the stream, and the amount of discharge equals recharge in the long term. Then you get developed conditions with pumping wells. You get a removal of water, a decrease of discharge to the streams, and sometimes you increase the area of recharge to the aquifer system by the pumping. However, real life's not that simple. That's the textbook. Groundwater systems are very complex, and that's because there's lots of input factors that control it in a groundwater model, and each aquifer river valley system is unique because the distribution of the stream, how it meanders, is all different, and how tributaries come into each valley system. Every area is unique. So the good news is that groundwater flow models could take into account all the complexities everywhere. And I just show you that this is one differential equation of a computation, what goes on in one cell in a groundwater model. That computes the water level in that well, in that cell, and the flow. And typically today there's 10,000 cells in a model. So 10,000 times that cranking is what today's models do. So how does the Corning aquifer work? This is the elevation of pre-pumping conditions from the old SRBC. These are the water table contour lines. They're showing higher elevation on the north side of the valley wall and lower elevation contours on the south. So groundwater flows from higher head to lower head. So the direction of groundwater flow shown by the arrows is that groundwater flows from the North Valley wall and discharges to the Chemung River along the South Valley wall into the Cohocton River over here. That's pre-pumping conditions. Under pumping conditions, there's a large cone of depression that has formed in the city of Cortland in the east side of it, in the central east side. And the cone of depression is so deep that it reverses the flow direction out front in the system. The stream water flows out of the stream into the cone of depression to the wells. So there's a lot of loss of stream flow in this reach. 60% of the pumpage is derived from induced infiltration from the streams in this 1988 scenario, pumping condition 1988. Back in 88, there was more pumpage than today. That was 10 million gallons a day. Today we're down to 6 or 7, I believe, in the Corning area. So looking at sustainability, the limited definition, just considering the flow, according to the DEC, the estimated low flow criteria, SIMQ10 low flow is 86 CFS is needed to flow by the sewer treatment plant to take care of wastewater assimilation. That's a drought period over the lowest 7-day flow during a 10-year period. That's called the 7Q10 flow. However, that's a severe drought condition, but a moderate drought condition is usually considered 95% flow in the Chemung River, which is 132, versus the severe drought, which is 86. So they computed the potential water availability in the system to be the difference, 86 and 46 CFS. That's just considering water budget, not economic, environmental, sociological. Other definitions, there are more than one estimates of safe or sustainable yields. The Leggett report reports 23 and 24 million gallons a day are available from the stream, and the old USGS report estimated 19.5, so somewhere a little less. The recent permitting amounts allowable from DEC in the Corning aquifer only, I took a subset of Rachel's. I just picked the municipalities in the Corning aquifer, not the entire Susquehanna system. So the 5 municipalities total permitting system is 19.6 million gallons for the Corning. That's what they consider the maximum safe yield. I don't know if that includes, it does not include, okay, so that's interesting. The history of water use, in 1988, when the SRBC model, it was 10.2 million gallons of pumpage, which 6 was from the induced from the stream, and painted post was 1.8 then. In 2002, when Leggett rebuilt the model, the pumpage from the aquifer was 7. Painted post was down to 0.44, and I still believe it's around there now today. So from a standpoint of just pumping yield, not environment, ecosystem, et cetera, the painted post well 4 could probably provide the additional 1. So cumulative, however, that doesn't take account the cumulative consumptive use, that is being water export. Now we're getting loss of water from the system. Most pump water in the past, even though it's pumped from the wells, is returned to the streams through the sewage treatment plants. So you don't get a net loss of water out of our systems usually. You get a little bit, but not much. Most of it doesn't go back to the aquifer, but it goes out to the stream. So water's pumped from the aquifer, goes to our houses, goes back to the sewer treatment plant, and they put it back into the river. So no little net loss. But now, when we export water, you get a net loss that's not returned to the water system. So you got to consider these exports when computing the low flow conditions, because now you have a lower flow because you got a loss of stream flow from exporting water. So those numbers should be calculated based on exported loss of water to the streams. And also you need to consider the cumulative pumping effects. If all the municipalities, if Bath exports water for drilling, if Painted Post and Corning and South Corning and Big Flats and Elmira all do it. So all of those pump 1 million gallons a day. Now we're talking, substantial stream losses of cumulative losses, exports of 10 millions of gallons a day. So you got to consider the cumulative again, like was early in the stream losses. So, like I said, the current model has a number of weaknesses. In addition, some other things that need to be evaluated. Like one of them, I noticed that most USGS models, what we do in river valley systems in the Northeast, we show that most of the recharge aquifers comes from upland sources, the runoff from adjacent hillsides and losing streams. And typically, in USGS models, we find typically 60% of recharge water to aquifer systems come from upland sources, 40% from precipitation. However, the SRBC and Leggett has the reverse. They model 60% from precip, 40 from uplands. So I think their concept of how aquifer systems work is kind of outdated in the old model. And that should be revisited when rebuilding or updating a new model. I think we should, like I said, most models now have the reverse, showing more recharge from uplands. And we also need to look at the local setting. It's fine to look at the regional view, and sometimes pumping seems to have a little impact. But you start looking at more locally and small scale around the pumping well, you see that when you start delineating contributing areas and looking within those contributing areas, you see lots of other things you should be concerned about, like contamination sites, streams, wetlands, springs, or rare ecosystems. So to evaluate whether pumping will have an adverse impact, you got to look at all those items if they're present in the contributing area. So you need to, for instance, look at the local setting of the pumping well number 4. Since pumping well number 4 is actually not is actually in the Cohocton River basin. It's not in the Chemung. And the Cohocton is a much smaller stream. It's about 30% the size of the Chemung. So actually, the drainage area of Cohocton is 600, and the Chemung is 2,000. All those DEC computations of low flow, sustainable yield are based on the gauge of Chemung at the larger volume than the Cohocton. So I think those numbers for case for well number 4 should be recomputed for the smaller Cohocton system rather than the Chemung. So this is where well number 4 is, next to the old foundation contamination site. And this is the Cohocton River I just mentioned. And the groundwater flow model indicated groundwater flows to the Cohocton River, not to the Chemung. So this is the major factor. And you have other major pumping wells going on near the Cohocton too. So you got to look at all the cumulative induced infiltration of all those wells and see the impact of this smaller river system. Since Painted Post Well 4 is near a contamination site, and pumping may result in water level declines that result in groundwater gradient from the site to the well, you need to collect periodic water quality samples to determine whether contaminants are being drawn off the contaminated site to the well. And the sampling must be continued long enough to take into account the time of travel it takes from groundwater to move that distance from the contamination site to the well. You can't turn on the well in that afternoon, sample the water, and expect to see if you're getting contamination from the site. It could take weeks, months, travel time to go that distance. Groundwater was very slow, moves 5-10 feet a day. So you got to keep on sampling and monitoring that pumping well to see eventually what will be the chemistry that stabilizes it. That's the last slide. So I'm allowed. Oh, I have 5 minutes left. I'm allowed 5 questions for right now, and I guess later on afterwards we can have more time for more questions. Yes.
It was a marvelous presentation.
No, thank you.
Focusing specifically on the exported water from.
That's kind of oh, well, it's a comment rather than a question. Yeah, I think you overstep probably calling it an act of crime or anything like that, because it's a consumptive use. It's loss of water, and there are cases of consumptive use and loss of water for different reasons than fracking. Oh, those crimes too. So it's just because it's a loss of water doesn't mean it's a crime. So and real logistic law really isn't either. Oh, okay. So you're saying that the water use will be that it'll get contaminated by being injected for gas drilling purposes. So that, yeah. Yeah, whether that's a crime, I don't know. In real law, legal term, I still don't think it's a crime, that term. But it's a shame. I would say with that, it's a shame to see fresh water being used and being contaminated in that way. Yeah, and that's where the shoes I stepped into tonight is. I was trained as USGS not to have my own opinions, just provide information and you make decisions. So that's what I'm presenting tonight. This is what, as a generic hydrologist, I would look at the problem. This is the information I would want to look at and what I would like to see to tackle the problem. And one of them is to update the model, absolutely. But is there any plan right now? Not that I know of. But this is the starting point right now today. These are the things we should look at and should be brought up. So. Yeah, the DEC may have used the wrong river segment for computing low flow criteria for safe yield for painted post. Yeah. Right. Yes.
Are there differences in termination?
Yeah, that's absolutely a possibility. I don't know if that's been studied in Corning aquifer, but you drill deep enough, you get into salty brine water in valleys. And usually it happens below the sand and gravel deposits into the rock, about 50 to 100 feet below in the rock. You get brine water in the bedrock, and sometimes that level of brine salty water extends to the bottom of the sand and gravel aquifer. So pumping wells can induce and bring up some salty water up higher. So that's a possibility, but I don't know specifically what is the chemistry, where that brine layer is here. And there are other changes in chemistry besides brine too. There's other local stuff, but I haven't looked closely at the chemistry variations in depth of this aquifer. Radium. I am.
1,600 years.
Yeah, and I'm not. I'm uncertain. I can't grasp is how soluble it is, and does it move with the water or not? It is. Okay. Well, it'll flow with water, so it could be pumped and captured by a well if it's soluble and moves with water. Yeah. I don't know what levels are in the aquifer system offhand, but if they. Yes. Yeah, I think the average water use per person is 75 gallons a day. So if you have a household 2.3, it's 180 gallons per household, so something like that. Yeah. See, municipal wells supply drinking water and commercial water. So it's hard to say how much each household uses, because we don't know how much the businesses use. Yeah, so that's a water use question. So you will probably concentrate more thinking about the water availability more than the environment. Oh, okay. Well, it's a package, so you got so that's why this is a complex issue. It gets messy. Someone way in the back. Yeah, and see the numbers, safe yield, permanent amount of water withdrawals are very crude numbers done without models. And the point I wanted to make today, you have to look at the whole system, regional system, in addition, locally around each pumping well. You got to look at individually what's going on, and only groundwater models can answer all those questions. It could do lots of incredible things that I didn't even cover today about budgets and what ifs, and they're amazing tools. And then I just strongly hope that someone picks up and updates the model. And I think that's it.
There will. More questions can be asked of Todd in our regular Q&A. I just wanted to have a chance to have a few questions asked right now. And let's have another applause for Todd's presentation, and for Mary and for Rachel as well. But I'm going to introduce now Sandra Steingraber, biologist, author, cancer survivor, PhD. She writes about climate change, ecology, links between human health and the environment. She's an activist with We Are Seneca Lake, and we have some defenders right here. And she's currently a distinguished scholar in residence at Ithaca College in Ithaca, New York. So let's hear from Sandra Steingraber.
Thank you, Diane. It's a real honor to be here in Corning with you today, and to be your last speaker, so thank you. And I'm also one of the co-founders of Concerned Health Professionals of New York, and it's really out of that capacity that I'll be speaking today. And my assigned task was to kind of present everything you just heard and put it in a big picture and talk about steps for the future. So I took that very literally. So let's go. 73% of our planet's surface is covered by water. Water is the defining characteristic of this planet that we inhabit. It makes life possible. All of us are 65% water by weight. So we exist in an exquisite communion with whatever water system we find ourselves in. If you have contaminants in your water supply, actually most of them come into your blood plasma, not by drinking your water, but by bathing and showering. A half an hour shower is the exposure equivalent of a half a gallon of drinking tap water. So you can drink all the bottles of French water you want. You can have a Brita filter in your kitchen, but every time you step in the shower, take a bath, whatever's in your public water system is inside of you. It's inside of your cerebral spinal fluid. It's inside of your heart. It's in the exhaled breath that you breathe, and so on. So you cannot opt out of your water system. Of all the water on Earth, 98% of it is seawater. Only 2% is fresh water. And half of that fresh water is locked up on the ice caps on either the North or the South Pole, leaving only half of that fresh water, 1% of all the Earth's water, in the form of actually liquid drinkable water. So fresh water really is the 1%. It's a tiny thimbleful of all the water that exists on the planet that we live on. And as you heard from Todd and saw so beautifully in some of his visuals, I'll describe them to you in language now, that water on our planet, that fresh water, exists everywhere. It exists essentially in three sectors. The atmosphere as water vapor, as clouds. It comes down to us as rain and snow, as fog. It exists on the surface of our planet where we live as rivers and streams and lakes. And it exists in the unseen landscape below our feet, held in aquifers. And all three of these sectors, the atmospheric water, the surface water, and the groundwater, they're all connected. And we tend to think, and this is Rachel Carson's language now, that groundwater is the mother of surface water, and that's a true thing. But you could start the story just as easily with the rain and the snow that falls, which like a falling curtain enters the soil where it's filtered, and then enters our aquifers, and then through artesian pressure, especially in a confined aquifer, as you now know, it can come up, bubble up to the surface and become the headwaters of our rivers and streams, and from there into our lakes. And so water moves constantly among these three: air, surface, subterranean planet, but it moves at different rates. So that in the Cohocton River, for example, you have a flow rate we can measure. It's a matter of days before the water that you see is gone. That's why they say you can't step in the same river twice, right? Whereas Seneca Lake, north of us, the residence time of that water is about 35 years. Eventually it will drain to the north and end up in Lake Ontario and eventually out to the Atlantic Ocean, but it takes 35 years for that water to leave. Some of the groundwater aquifers below our feet, residence time is more than 1,000 years. But eventually that water too will eventually come to the surface. It moves, it will become rain once again. And as it flows in this hydrologic cycle, it turns into living things, right? Because water is also not just a hallmark of our planet in a kind of earth science element, but it's also life itself. It makes life possible. So in between, as it cycles around, it becomes blood plasma, it becomes the sap of trees, it becomes honey and nectar and all kinds of other liquid things that feed us and make the whole ecosystem work. Water is part of every faith-based religion as a sacrament. In my own faith-based religion, I grew up in the Methodist Church. Water was baptism. And so it has a cultural meaning for us as something holy, as something sacred in almost all faith traditions. In terms of groundwater, about half of all Americans drink it as their source of water. It tends to be the water that people in rural areas drink, whereas the other half of Americans that rely on surface water tend to live in more urban areas. So one of the things that makes the Corning aquifer unique is that, well, not unique, but it's a little unusual in that it provides so much drinking water for a larger municipal area. And that's a lucky thing because of the two kinds of water that we use for drinking water, groundwater tends to be the less contaminated of the two because it is protected. Even if it's an unconfined aquifer, there's a chance for that water as it falls as precipitation and filters down into the aquifer to be filtered. If there's any clay, it adsorbs contaminants onto it. So aquifers function as a filtration system, if you will, for all of our water as it's cycling through. Those of us who grew up in places where rivers are captured into reservoirs and that becomes our drinking water, that water tends to be more vulnerable to contamination and there are more problems associated with it. So it's a lucky thing that you have this Corning aquifer here. As you heard, the Corning aquifer catches precipitation from a very large area and it's funneled into this aquifer. As you know, there are 4 rivers that come together in a confluence here in Painted Post. And the aquifer exists underneath that X-shaped confluence, almost like a mirror image. It's also X-shaped. And what makes it unusual is that it's a very complex hydrology. And again, I'm just using language to kind of review again what you just saw visually, in case you're more of a verbal thinker than a visual thinker. But those 4 rivers, the Cohocton, the Tioga, the Canisteo, and the Chemung that join together have underneath them these antecedents, the aquifers that exactly match them. And there's a two-way flow between this surface water and the groundwater underneath, which is also a bit unusual, because the more typical situation is that the groundwater would simply become the headwaters of streams and rivers, and you wouldn't necessarily see the rivers and streams being pulled down into an aquifer. But in fact, you do see that here. It's a kind of breathing that goes on between the subterranean water beneath our feet and the surface water that you can see as you drive around in this beautiful area. And one of the hazards of having two-way communication between surface water and groundwater is that if there is contamination in the surface water and then you pull it into the groundwater, you can contaminate your aquifer in ways that you might not otherwise do. You know that the water here on Earth has been here basically since the beginning of time for all practical purposes. We're not making any more of it. So when my children were young, we used to laugh and drink water and say we're all drinking dinosaur pee, right? Or we were drinking things that used to be the sap inside of trees and the blood inside of 1,000 animals. So it doesn't go away, but we're not making any more of it. It just goes around and around like this. So last week, an important study was released in the journal called Science Advances from NASA that pointed out that we now are facing a global water scarcity. So that announcement was made last week. That's affecting already somewhere between 1.7 and 3.1 billion people. And that is, they concluded in this massive study, is due to both increased demand on water, so there's overconsumption of water, but also because of climate change. And that is causing a couple problems. One is actually it's lowering harvests because there's less water available through both precipitation and irrigation. It's interfering with navigation in some parts of the world, and it's actually causing salination, increased salt intrusion into the aquifers. And I'll just read you, this is hardly a technical conclusion, but right out of the study, quote, "The water tables are dropping all over the world. We are running out of water." So I present that because it almost sounds like a paradox based on what I just said about the cycle of water, things never being created, water not being destroyed, and it seems like it might be a contradiction in terms. So just to put a little finer point on that, what the NASA study shows is not that water is disappearing, but fresh water, in terms of our relationship to it in human communities, is becoming less available to us. And that happens because we are pumping groundwater out of our aquifers at a faster rate now than it's being recharged globally all over the world. And when you do that, and again, I'm kind of reiterating what's already been said here very well, it's not that you're making that water disappear, but rather you are, let's say you're taking water, you're a farmer and you want to irrigate your field and you're pumping out of an aquifer. So you're now watering your crops and some of that water becomes the sap of the crops. And then some of it's transpired and evaporates and ends up as clouds, which might drift out to sea and rain down on all the ships at sea. So you're just transferring that water from some place that people can use but is not usable anymore. So by contrast, however, fracking actually makes water disappear, and I think that the comment that you made speaks to that. We're actually, when you sell the water in the Corning aquifer across the border for fracking operations, you're actually now burying it underneath our deep aquifers, and it will never again be part of the hydrological cycle. So you're actually absenting it from the hydrologic cycle, and that's a completely different thing. I wrote about that phenomenon in one of my most recent books, both in a fairly technical way and then also in a more lyrical way. So just to kind of put a fine point on that, I'll just read a couple sentences about what that means. What happens to water during fracking is different from what happens to water when you leave the tap running while brushing your teeth. When a single well is fracked, several million gallons of fresh water are removed from groundwater aquifers and are entombed in deep geological strata up to a mile or more below the water table. It is removed from the water cycle permanently, as in forever. It will no longer swirl with tadpoles or ripple with fish. It will no longer ascend into clouds, freeze into snowflakes, melt into rivulets, cascade over rocks, turn with the tide, soak into soil, rise through roots, or flow from your tap. It will not become blood, tears, sweat, urine, milk, sap, nectar, yolk, honey, or the juice of a fruit. It will never again float a leaf boat, swell a bud, quench a thirst, fill a swamp, spill over an edge, slosh, dribble, trickle, spray, splash, glisten, drip, or never again fog, mist, frost, ice, dew, or rain. It's gone. So that is a qualitatively different thing than humans have ever done with water before. And I think that's something to think about as you make decisions about how to move forward here in Painted Post and Corning area. There are, of course, health impacts to contaminating the aquifer. One of them is been discussed here at length. There is already a contamination source in your aquifer. Right now, it's not really affecting drinking water aquifer, but should you alter the flow by drawing a lot from well number 4, you could pull that contamination into the cones of influence where water that people drink are going to be drawn from. In addition, and I haven't heard this one mentioned yet, in the Cohocton River upstream from here, there are other industrial activities, including a company called Crestwood, which operates gas storage facilities and salt caverns around Savona and Bath. They have a permit just renewed. I and Sierra Club work together in opposition to that. Their permit allows them to dump a considerable amount of brine into the Cohocton River, which flows here. So since we know that the Cohocton can be drawn down into your aquifer, as you pump it out, it's possible that the salination created by that kind of discharge could actually end up in people's drinking water. Increased levels of sodium and chloride have health impacts. They're related to hypertension, not only in older people, but also if you increase sodium levels in infant formula, for example, you can actually alter blood pressure in infants. We know quite a lot about that. No one is looking at the cumulative impacts of what's happening upstream from Crestwood, what's happening downstream here with water sales, and how those two things might have synergistic or additive impacts. There's nothing in the law that requires that to happen before permits are issued. So it's up to all of you and your elected officials to be smart and to think about these things in a sober and serious way. So in terms of next steps, I have 3 ideas. One is that the Village of Painted Post must study this issue really thoroughly and bring good science and knowledge to bear. And that requires elected officials to not be hear no evil, see no evil. You know, it's very easy for elected officials to really not study something closely. So later on, when something goes wrong, they could say, well, gee, we didn't know that would happen. And that's exactly the story of my hometown and why I began to study water contamination as a biologist, and it's become my life's work. Because in my hometown, there was a spill of dry cleaning fluid. I live also in an area of complex hydrology. My hometown in Illinois was actually built over top of the ancient Mississippi River before its current location on the border of Illinois and Iowa, where a glacier kind of bulldozed it over there. But prior to last glaciation, the hometown where I lived on represented the sand dunes of the ancient Mississippi River. So it is an unconfined aquifer. And when people used a lot of cutting fluids and dry cleaning fluids for industry and dumped it out back 80 years ago, it very easily influenced that aquifer. I developed bladder cancer at the age of 20. My diagnosing physician said almost certainly because of an environmental cause. When I went back to my hometown as a Harvard-trained biologist in my 30s, I was able to document a cancer cluster there, very likely related to the water contamination. I wrote a book about it. There's a film about it. You might know about it. That doesn't necessarily mean I can go back and have Thanksgiving dinner in my hometown anymore. Because once you have a problem like that that can't be fixed, it's very hard to talk about, right? Because it's very polarizing to think that you have a problem, your children are drinking this stuff, and there's nothing you can do about it now. And talking about it is only affecting your property values and only making tourists not want to come there. And so it becomes a harder conversation to have then than it is now. So that's why you need good science now. And this model that could be done with up-to-date computer systems in the right part of the river and really take a look at that data. And second, I want to invite elected officials from all other municipalities in this aquifer area to participate in this larger conversation. They must also engage, because what happens in Painted Post affects everyone downstream, which is why I'm really thrilled that we have some elected officials here who are being very brave and just taking this information in. Bill Boland is here, who's deputy mayor of Corning and also I'm the city councilman. Anyone else here as an elected official today? Tell us who you are. Thank you. Thank you very much. So you guys are the apostles for your other elected officials and public servants. Yes, who are you?
David Smith, Painted Post trustee.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Please take back what you've heard. And we're very glad you're here. That's what public officials are supposed to be doing, taking all this in and making wise decisions on behalf of their constituents. And then third, you, the citizens, have to speak out. You need to make your voices heard. And letters to the editor, I think, are still the very best way to do that. Those are read by elected officials, and they're read by your friends and neighbors. So find your voices and speak out. I think we have two assists in this task, this larger task, in considering all this science and moving forward wisely. And one comes to us internationally from the climate negotiations in Paris, which are now have resulted in an international treaty that makes very clear that a new day is at hand. Our energy system is actually moving toward renewables. A very strong political signal is now being sent to the business community that the smart money and the investments are moving in renewables, which means, as you move forward and think about these things, the question to ask is Painted Post hitching its financial future and selling its water, which is life itself, to a dying industry? Chesapeake Energy just announced it's pulling out of Pennsylvania and so forth. So what future does this have? How wise is that, given the signals coming out of Paris? And then lastly, the governor himself has given us an assist. I don't think I've ever ended a talk by giving the governor the last word, but I'm going to do that today. Governor Cuomo has announced there's a rapid response team he's forming for protecting drinking water for all New Yorkers. As co-chairs of that rapid response team are Basil Sagos, his chair of his Department of Environmental Conservation, together with Dr. Howard Zucker, the Department of Health chair. So that's a strong signal to us that he's taking that actually very seriously by putting those two men in charge of this. And here's what the governor had to say, and I'll close here. Every New Yorker has the right to clean and safe drinking water. Water is a priceless resource that requires the highest level of protection, and I am proud to continue this administration's legacy of standing up for the environment. We are taking aggressive and proactive steps to ensure clean and healthy communities throughout the state, both for current residents and for generations to come. So now it's up to us and our elected officials to let the governor know what the situation here is in Painted Post and ask for the apparatus from our state level government to join our local municipal efforts here and make sure that the blood plasma of the generations of people to come who live here flows as purely as it does for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandra, and thank you to all of the speakers. Let's have another round of applause for all of the speakers. I'm going to ask Rachel Treichler to come up and take the questions and direct. You may direct them to any of the speakers, but and she will repeat the question as she gives it. Okay. Thank you, Rachel. And by the way, Rachel is the one who brought this forum together. She has been working on this since 2012, at least. So let's also strong.
Well, thank you, Diane. You've been a wonderful moderator. Diane doesn't hear so well in one of her ears, so she asked me if I would repeat the question. So I'm doing that for the virtue of our video camera. So we are open for questions. Gentleman there with the glasses. So I'll repeat the question, and then the question is, if someone lives near the river, can they drill a well and take less than 100,000 gallons a day, and they don't need a permit? And the question's asked to Todd.
Two things are going on there. One, a lot of municipalities, like cities, I know City of Cortland, have passed a law where private residents cannot drill their own well within the city for purposes of a drinking water supply. So you do have to look up what are the local laws governing drilling your own wells for that purpose. Perhaps a fellow from the city of Corning could expand that. No? Okay. And as far as the amount of water you can pump, assuming you can drill a well, it's governed by the DEC. And I don't know what the cap is where you don't need a permit and when you do need a DEC permit, but there is a level where at a certain pumping level where the DEC does come in and regulate the pumping. I don't know, does anyone know what that level is in DEC here? It is 100,000. Okay, so you're right. So if you drill less than 100,000 and there's no local government restricting you to do so, you could drill your own well at that amount.
But there is one more consideration, because the DEC permitting law does say that this does not override riparian rights, and riparian rights are the rights of your neighbors not to be harmed by your withdrawal. So if your neighbors are being harmed, they can sue you for that, even if you're, even if you don't need a permit, or even if you have a permit. If you're harming your neighbors, then you can be sued. Yeah. Other questions with the gentleman, Paul Otruba? So there was a comment made by Paul Otruba that if you become responsible for the contents of the water you sell, and if it is contaminated, you might be responsible. You, sir, in the hat. So the question is, why does Painted Post think they own the water to be able to sell it in the first place? And I don't know if anyone wants to touch that question. Ann Finneran, do you want to come up and answer it, or make it? Well, just so if you're on the video, if you're speaking to the microphone, if people who are toward the front want to come up and ask their questions at the microphone, that's fine. And people want to, but if you're a Painted Post resident,
I'm not a resident, I'm a native.
a native, she for many years was a resident. Do you have a quick answer, or?
The Judge Fisher actually kind of answered that when he said that one of the lawsuits, what he wrote in his decision was that you cannot sell water as if it is surplus government property, like an old snowplow or something. So I think that because they are permitted to use up to 4 million a day, 4 million gallons a day, and they were really only using 400,000 a day for residential purposes, they felt that they had excess water that they could dispose of freely. So that was, I guess that's something of an answer.
And if you think that Anne looks similar to Mary, she is her twin. But I completely agree with your question, sir, myself. Way at the back yes.
Yeah, absolutely. I would suggest putting on Rachel's site, because that she has the best resource of references on the Corning aquifer I've seen. So that's where I would suggest putting it.
Okay. So we'll add his presentation, the PDF of the slides, and the video that Bob Nielsen and David Walczak. I'd just like to thank very much our videographers, Bob and Dave, for being here and recording this, so that, yes, so please. So where are you going to post your video, gentlemen? Online and we will, if you sign up on our email list, we will send you the link, and I will put it on my website too.
I would think the logical place to look would be We Are Seneca Lake.
We Are Seneca Lake. Okay, so we will have the video and the presentations. Mary.
Do I have a question?
Yeah, we're taking questions.
Okay.
The question was, we test for barium and strontium in the streams every 6 months. That's true. And your question was, do we test for radioactivity?
If the strontium or barium are radioactive, strontium or barium.
I don't know that. I don't think they are. But we don't test in any way for radioactivity in our work.
Okay.
Sorry.
Yes. Bill. No, I'm,
I'll talk to him later.
okay, no, I'm calling on the person behind you.
My understanding is that this.
Okay, good question. A question is, how is the Susquehanna River Basin performing its responsibilities to manage the water resources in the basin? Do you want to, I mean, I'll make some comments, but I'll let Todd go first.
SRBC is the lead agency in charge of water withdrawals for drilling purposes in the basin. And in a nutshell, they don't want to see too much water withdrawn so it doesn't get to Chesapeake Bay, because the lack of water is causing the eutrophic problems down there. That said, they do allow a number of withdrawals for drilling purposes, and it's nice to know an agency is closely regulating that. It's better than having no agency or some agency you don't particularly trust, but I trust them. They set up these monitoring stations like Sentinels stations with the SON units, so I think they do a good job. Their hands are tied in the Painted Post number 4 well, because that well was drilled before SRBC came into existence, and that well and permitting is grandfathered. So essentially, SRBC can't touch what goes on with that permitting of that well. So there's some limitations to what they can do, unfortunately. So other than that, I don't know too much more about the SRBC.
Well, I may not be quite as complimentary as Todd to the SRBC, because I have researched quite carefully with respect to the lawsuit, because one of the claims was that the SRBC approval preempted preempted the CEQA review. So I looked into how SRBC approves, and I will give the SRBC a lot of credit for looking at water withdrawals for the consumptive use of gas drilling. They are saying that you need to have a permit for any withdrawal for that consumptive use. And when you take water out of a river, they look into it. But where their scrutiny fails, in my opinion, is from municipal, when they're allowing gas drillers to buy water from a municipality. So, for example, the town of Irwin has a more recent water withdrawal permit that was issued by the SRBC. Their permits are newer, and they were not grandfathered. The Painted Post water withdrawal permits have been grandfathered. But there's a second step. A gas driller has to apply to use water from the municipal water system that they're purchasing through one of these bulk sale agreements. And the SRBC is not examining those in the same way that they examine other water withdrawals. So these water purchases are escaping review, essentially. The DEC is allowing them to escape review. And as Mary said, for example, with the town of Irwin sale to Schweppe, the way that is recorded on the SRBC website, it says only town of Morningside. It doesn't say estate. It doesn't say town. It says Morningside Heights. I thought Morningside Heights was in New York City. I had no idea that Morningside Heights referred to the town of Irwin. So the town of Irwin, the approval they gave to Schweppe to buy from the town of Irwin is sort of hidden on their website. And if there's an application to withdraw water from a stream, that application is posted on their website. There's a lot of there's studies that have to be done, and all that's public information on the website. When they grant an approval to purchase water from a municipality, the approvals that they granted for painted posts were actually issued in emails. These emails were not posted anywhere. We had great difficulty getting copies of the emails, and we were finally able to get them from Schweppe. They claiming that that these approvals preempted any CEQA review, but at first they wouldn't even give us a copy of the approvals, and when we finally saw them, they were emails. So this, the municipal water sale route is, it is sort of a loophole, but still the SRBC is doing more to review water sales for gas drilling than the DEC, because they are starting at 0, so that's good. I'm going to choose someone who hasn't asked a question before.
I want to comment more on the SRBC.
Oh yeah, sorry, go ahead.
I just want to reiterate that the SRBC has given more permits for water withdrawal than there is water in the system, supposedly, and that they're basically a rubber stamper. And if anybody wants to see the gas drilling water permits, you can go to the SRBC water resource portal, and they have a section that shows natural gas drilling, and there are a slew. All the natural gas companies who have been given permits are listed there. So if anybody wants to go through that, it's kind of interesting. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. Sorry. Yeah. So yes.
I had a quick question.
So let's take the first question here is a question for Todd about a new mod flow study. How long would that take, and how much would it cost?
To take a Cadillac approach that Leggett, Brasher, and Graham recommended, rebuilding a new model with collecting new data also is usually a 2 to 3 year effort. 1 year, 1.5 year collect the data, and a year to build the model, and maybe a half year to write the report. And so figure salary of $100,000 to $120,000 per year, so we're talking about $300,000 to $400,000 to build a brand new one. To modify the existing one, which you can also do, we won't be perfect, but be a lot better, maybe a year, so maybe around $50,000 to $100,000.
May I ask you a question to follow up on that? Are there any sort of government grants or programs that could help shoulder part of that cost?
I don't know offhand, I really don't. Sorry.
And so she also asked about brine, road spreading. Does someone want to answer questions about brine? I mean, Riverkeeper published a good study last summer in July, and they looked at the beneficial use determinations that have been published for the roads. Steuben County does use brine from the Savona gas storage site on the roads. It's not using frac flowback, but Riverkeeper says that tests of that brine also showed benzene and toluene and other contaminants. So even that brine is not without risk. So there were other questions there, Rich Hurley. So the question for Todd is, what is the rate of flow 1,000 feet back from the Chemung River in a rain event?
Yeah, so let me reframe the picture. So a valley contains the sand and gravel. The hills contain fairly impermeable till over bedrock. So runoff off the hills is fast, and it's mostly 80% surface runoff, 20% groundwater. The surface runoff is very rapid, happens less than a day to several days to get to the hilltops and out the main stem river. Once the groundwater, however, seeps into the edge of the aquifer along the edges, groundwater flows a lot slower, several feet per day, 5 to 10 typically. So for groundwater to flow, now, and that's the difference. We're talking, I don't know, you want to answer surface water velocity or groundwater velocity. So they're two very different. So groundwater, to get from the edge of the valley to the river in Corning situation, to cross the valley, will probably take about a year to maybe a year and a half would be my guess, maybe 2 years. But again, surface runoff travels miles per day, so that's a different animal than groundwater flow. Yes.
So, well, I saw Professor Flynn had his hand up, and then Jerry back in the back, but we'll do Professor Flynn first.
Yes, Rachel, this is a question for you. I will preface it, however, with an opening stanza from a poem that I...
Okay, would you like to speak at the mic?
Thank you, Rachel. I'm Joe Flynn from Alfred. I am asking Rachel a question about a comment she made about the law, but I'm prefacing it with reading the first stanza of a poem that I've distributed and put in the back of the room. The poem is called "The New We Need to Know," and it was originally written and delivered in June of 2011 at a conference up in Ithaca. Morning, moment in the sun. We climb the hill to where the gassed hawks can't hunt, to a lake wise people fish to foster tomorrow's dreams. One knee on the weedy shore, there to cup with palms and fingers, the way our mothers taught us. We scoop, bathe, rinse, and drink the cool, clear water. Then let the sunshine dry the hollows of our hands. My question, Rachel, is about riparian law and whether or not it applies to private individuals who, let us say, own a 300 to 500 acre piece of property and are selling their water to the hydrofracking companies, what we call in the trade as truck watchers, midnight requisitions. And this goes back to the question of either beggar or love thy neighbor.
So the answer is yes, riparian law applies to all users, including private users. So it would apply, generally you have to show harm. So Jerry, so the question is, how can our concerns get into Painted Post SECRA process? And the way that is to attend the Painted Post Village Board meetings when they are talking about their plans, to make comments at the public comment sessions, which happen at every meeting when they are, if they hold a hearing, to speak at the hearing. The village meets on the second Monday of each month, I believe, at 7 p.m. in the Painted Post Village Hall. Next meeting is March 14th. So we need a good contingent to attend those meetings and speak. Now, an issue has been raised, who can speak at a Painted Post Village Board meeting? For many issues, the village limits it to people who live in the village. My own opinion is when we have if the village is making a decision that affects the whole region, I would hope they would take comments from everyone who might be affected. But, we'll have to see. You have another question, Jerry?
Is there any way to collect all these concerns by email specifically to each meeting so that people don't necessarily have to attend? And you kind of accumulate all of them.
Well, we have an email sign-up list that we will be sharing information on, and if somebody wants to volunteer to be sort of a reporter for Painted Post Village Board meetings and make reports to our email list, which is the people in this room or who others, does anyone want to volunteer to take on that role of being a reporter to the group? Elizabeth. Okay. So, Elizabeth, why don't you come up and make your suggestion?
One of the things that I do practically every day is sign a petition about something or another, and these are actually very powerful. The ones that aren't just a hook to get you to give money to the thing. But we could certainly start a petition which would get everybody involved, have their say, and then we will deliver it to Painted Post board. But I think that's a very good way to get people involved. I'd also just like to make a couple of announcements about upcoming events that I think this group would be interested in. People for a Healthy Environment, one of the co-sponsors of today, is putting on a series of 4 forums, which will be discussions along the lines of whose is it. And then the first one, which will be on March 22nd, also here in the library, is about water. So it can be seen very much as part 2 of this discussion here. Ours will be a lot more general. It'll not concentrating on Corning and Painted Post, but water in general. Who does it belong to? And then also another of my hats is I've been working with the Going Solar project, which is coming to an end. There are 3 more events, and I put some of these on the back table if anybody's interested. There will also be one on of the Going Solar things on the March 22nd, and that will be at Corning Community College at lunchtime. So that'll be a busy day, and it's World Water Day.
So, yes, Allison. So Allison King is Todd Miller's wife, and also knowledgeable about the processes, and you've been doing things in Cortland, right? Do you want to talk a little bit about the secret process?
Well, I was going to ask about the seeker process. So if this is formal seeker, DEC actually has put out a proposed rules recommending that public scoping be part of seeker. It's optional, but if a entity chooses to do public scoping, then there's a set of procedures they have to follow and a set of things that need to be evaluated. And essentially that scope is a very detailed, an annotated outline of this is what we plan to evaluate. And it's a great opportunity for the public to weigh in and say, these are things that need to be assessed. So the kind of comments that came up here. That said, in Cortland County, the public scoping comments were pretty well ignored. And I would say you need to be vigilant throughout this process. We commented, we participated in hearings, we provided written comments, even in the final environmental impact statement. And this was a proposal to import incinerator ash, which has, heavy metals and dioxins in it. So even in the final environmental impact statement, it's got a list of substantive public comments. And if you look at the pages of tables, I went through from a health and toxicology standpoint and just compiled which of these have not been answered. So the major substantive public comments were not addressed in the final environmental impact statement, which was accepted by our county legislature. So my question to Rachel was going to be, given that some of these secret processes are rubber stamps, what redress do we have in Albany? There is new leadership within DEC. What can we do to make seeker more meaningful and more responsive?
A very good question, and I might invite people from PAG and with their horsehead situation, but seeker, the standard that if you have a court review an agency's seeker decision is whether they took a hard look at the issues. And sometimes the courts are quite respectful, let's say, of the agency's decision. Now, there have been calls for strengthening SECRA in the state legislature, so that would be a good way to address this. So, the SECRA law is very specific about looking at environmental impacts, but how do we get our officials to do that? And that is, I think Sandra described, people getting out, raising the issues, and it can then be challenged. It can then be challenged in court, but the standard of review is sometimes difficult. So I'm gentleman in purple there.
Just a couple of years ago, the residents of Painted Post had an opportunity to decide whether there was a referendum about whether they want to remain a village or get absorbed into the town of Irwin. Let's say this deal was consummated between the village and Schweppe about selling the water, and then the residents of Painted Post decided they wanted to disband the village, disincorporate. What would happen to this contract between Schweppe and the village, a non-existent entity now? And what happens to the 4 million gallons a day that the Susquehanna River Basin says that entities would take out?
Well, the question is, what happens to the contract between the village and Schweppe if the village dissolves? And another question is, what happens to the SRBC approval? So the previous contract, I mean, they're going to negotiate, if they go forward with this, they're going to negotiate a new contract. But the previous contract, I believe, allowed either party to terminate the agreement at some point. I mean, the village had committed to sell some 300 million gallons of water over the term of the contract, but they didn't have to sell it at any particular time. And I believe there were sort of outs for both parties if they didn't want to continue with the agreement. Now, I do want to clarify the Susquehanna River Basin approval was not issued to the village. It was issued to Schweppe to buy from the village. If the Schweppe can't buy from the village, they can't buy from the village. And the SRBC did not approve any particular, it approved the amount of the contract, and the amount of the contract was 1 million gallons a day, not 4 million gallons a day. Yeah. Sandra, do you want to, yeah.
I just want to put a finer point on the issue of how to organize and do next steps. So to the point about getting something in writing as opposed to showing up at a meeting. You have to do both. You can't just say it once and be done. And this was a lesson a lot of us learned when the decision to frack or not frack New York was before us. So all of us who were in the medical field and biologists were organized into concerned health professionals of New York and asked to write letters to the governor, asked to come to communities and talk about the science. We did that, and then we were asked over and over again to do it again and again. I'm kind of shy, and I said, well, I did it once. Why do we have to keep doing it? Well, that's how it works. That's how political change turns out to be made. And so People for a Healthy Environment is a good group to be that organizer. I think, for example, a letter from local officials all throughout the Corning aquifer should go to the governor and go to every member of that rapid response team that now has stated their job is to protect New York's water. So somebody needs to draft that letter and go around and get sign-ons from all your local elected officials. And so an engaged citizen group, a small number of people, can be that leader. And then the rest of you just have to follow orders and keep showing up over and over again in every meeting, write letters to the editor over and over again. And Ruth Young, would you mind coming up and finishing my sentence for me? This is Ruth Young, former Schuyler legislator and citizen of this place. And she knows more than anyone else that I know, is so wise about how to do all this. Can I ask you to say a few things? I know I'm putting you on the spot. This is my hero, Ruth Young.
Well, this is a surprise note, and the only word I can think of right now comes from a political candidate that I happen to admire, and that is revolution. Power to the people. And when the people don't believe they have the power, they've already lost it. You need to do it all. I'm sorry, but sitting in front of the boom tube doesn't do it for us. We've sat there for too long, and now we look up in horror at what is happening. And instead of being totally horrified, we have to be totally activated. And so when Sandra says, do it, go to those meetings, get off the chair, go there, write the letters, she means it. I'm 78 years old, I'm damn near burned out, but I'm still there. Thank you.
I want to say one more thing in response to, and then we'll end. Yeah, Diane is calling this because our time is up. But I think that the citizens and the activists who are protecting Seneca Lake are a wonderful role model to us all. And thanks to Sandra and the other leaders of that effort. And I want to point out that how they turned around what was a very difficult regulatory situation, because when we first heard about gas storage happening on Seneca Lake, it was a done deal from what we heard. A done deal, negative declaration, it was going to go through. And then there was a lot of concern. So as a result of all the concern, the DEC did schedule a hearing. And at that hearing at the Watkins Glen High School, almost 900 people showed up. And when 900 people showed up, they scheduled a full environmental review. So the to get what we want comes from the public showing concern. And then we still heard the review was done. It sounded like it was still going to go through. But then people started, the objections continued anyway. The different parts of the community got involved. The wine industry got involved and went to Albany and talked to the governor. And after the wine industry got involved, the governor called for an issues conference. So this was another good step. So that now we are still waiting the results of the issues conference. But all of this has happened not because of what the law says, but because, the law creates an opportunity, but it's an opportunity that we as citizens have to act on, and we have to have lots of people involved to make this happen. So Diane, I'll let you close. You can finish. So thank you all for staying. That we only had the room till 1. I think the next meeting is at 2, so we have a little leeway. We want to invite you to join us for lunch, people that can, at the Woodhouse Grill, which is on Columbia Street, just a block away. And we thank all our speakers very, very much. Todd, thank you so much. Sandra, thank you so much. Mary, Bill, Henry. So we appreciate all of us, and we look forward to staying in touch and moving forward. And maybe PHE, that was a good suggestion for PHE to coordinate this.
So people around the world are taking action. And what you see is that when there is that kind of principled and courageous leadership from below, leadership at the community level rather than leadership from on high, is that then the politicians follow, right? So often it's posed as a choice between activism and law. But in fact, if we look at really key struggles where people are protecting their land, their water, and the planet as a whole in the process, it's that kind of leadership that leads to changes in policy that we all need.